He actually looks like Harry Potter as a young boy. If you Google Shostakovich Harry Potter, hours of fun, if not about 12 seconds of fun. There's a famous sort of image of him, and it's probably apocryphal. No one's quite sure, but it is representative. If it is apocryphal, because there is a truth to it. There's an image of him standing on the landing outside the family apartment in the apartment block in Moscow in the 30s, in the middle of the night, probably in winter, so it's freezing cold. He's standing there with his overcoat, hat, and scarf, and a small suitcase. And in the suitcase, he's packed some sort of overnight things. And he's just standing on the landing. The family, so he had a son and a daughter, and his wife, his first wife, they're in bed, perhaps asleep, certainly in their pajamas. But he's just standing on the landing for hours in the middle of the night, waiting, trembling, probably, expecting that at any moment the NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB, were coming to get him. And he would stand night after night, dressed with his overnight bag, if you like, waiting to be arrested. And it was not unreasonable to think that he might be, because very dear friends of his had been arrested, many had been sent to the Gulag, many had died, been executed. One friend, he'd had some powerful friends. There was a general in the Red Army called Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who was a marshal, and he loved music, was an amateur violinist, and had noticed at a conservatory concert that Shostakovich as a young man stood out, and so Tukhachevsky took an interest in him and started sort of, getting to know him and helping him, and then at one point, they would make music together, which is what musical friends often do, and he kept an eye on Dmitri. But actually, the 1930s proved that nobody was safe, because Stalin was one of his most paranoid times, and all kinds of people just suddenly disappeared. And you get a sense of that. If I mentioned the film The Death of Stalin, you get a sense of that, where you see Lavrenti Beria with his lists, different people on the list, and who are we going to go for tonight? It wasn't constant during Stalinism, but there were times when this was basically nightly. And so Shostakovich is entirely realistic to think that this might happen. And poor man, he didn't want the family to be disturbed when he was arrested. So he was every night outside the flat, waiting to go. It never came. But it's an extraordinary picture, and it represents something of him, because he was an incredibly jittery, nervous man. He was a chain smoker and was constantly on edge. And there are all kinds of stories from friends who would had witnessed that and would back up that image. But that is the image that actually was what lay behind Julian Barnes's relatively recent novel called The Noise of Time. And you can see on the cover there a sort of cartoon of him standing in the landing of his apartment block. It's a fascinating novel, obviously fictitious, and it's speculative. But there were points at which Shostakovich knew that he was in big trouble, and his friends knew that he was in big trouble. There's a whole business about one of his operas being reviewed in Pravda, and it's certainly the case that Stalin was involved in the review. It might even be the case that Stalin had written the review. But some of the things the hints dropped in sort of veiled language, but friends realized actually this could be it for Shostakovich after that review. It was entitled, the headline was Muddle Instead of Music. And this looked like the end. And you just think, this is insane, it's just a piece of music. But welcome to Stalin's Russia. I found this extraordinary little clip. It's literally about 3 or 4 seconds of Shostakovich himself walking down a street. I think it's in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad as was then. And he's walking past a sort of shop front, and there is a big portrait of Stalin in the window. And this little image, I don't know where it's from, this little scene, it captures him looking at the image and then walking on. Has no sound. 1936. There he is. So one more time. What is he thinking? Just that tiny little clip, I find incredibly moving. He's not committing a face crime there, but what is going on? Stalin had begun his ascent to the top of the Soviet tree before the Russian Revolution, so he got his nom de guerre, his nickname Stalin, steel-like. He was Georgian, so he had one of those Georgian surnames that ends in sort of Dashvili, and he'd actually trained for Orthodox priesthood at one point, so that's interesting. He was a voracious reader. I read a book basically about Stalin's library. His personal library was kept intact after he died. It was just put in boxes and just taken to the Kremlin and just left in a cellar. And in the few years after the end of communism, before the heat got turned up again, it was possible to research all over the Kremlin archives. And so one guy did research on Stalin's personal library. There were 20,000 books in it. And it's not just the fact that he had them on his shelves. He had notated pretty much all of them, his own handwriting, in English, French and Russian, literature, history. He went over and over and over again some of the big communist key texts, by Lenin or obviously Marx and Engels and stuff. So he repeatedly read those, but he read anything, works of theology, works of ornithology, all kinds of stuff. He was the most extraordinary reader. So it's not just for show. He had read these and absorbed and thought about them, which is fascinating, because that's not exactly the image you have of a brutal dictator. Someone who is highly intelligent, highly educated, incredibly thoughtful. And this book about his library comments on some of his marginalia, some of the things he was noticing in these books. You just think, wow. But Lenin died in the year that Shostakovich turned 18. Which means that basically the bulk of Shostakovich's adult life was spent with Stalin in power. Stalin always kept an eye out for the artistically brilliant, and Shostakovich was a genius. He was a prodigy, and so it's inevitable that he was noticed. He composed a funeral march at 12. He was admitted to the then Petrograd Conservatory age 13 to study piano and composition. And he was precocious, and he always wanted to be his own man. He didn't want to fit with the sort of long heritage of great Russian composers. He wanted to do his own thing. His teachers were very frustrated by the fact that, here was this 14, 15-year-old who basically was trying to imitate and learn from the modernists like Stravinsky and Prokofiev, rather than the greats, from the past of Tchaikovsky and Rimsky and all these other chaps. And he did learn his lessons, but he was trying to strike out on his own. Now, in order to graduate in 1926 from the Petrograd, or he had become Leningrad by then, conservatory, he did all his exams and everything else, and that was great, flying colours, but he also had to pass an exam in the methodology of Marxism. So you couldn't get any degree in anything without passing this paper. So everybody had to do it, and he failed. It was pretty much the only exam he ever failed in his life, and I think that's quite an accolade. So good for him. and so he had to retake it, and then eventually he passed. But in a way, that's, to my mind, is a hint of what's to come. Having to fit with the constraints of the political regime. But then he passed, and his graduation piece, age 19, was his first symphony. Okay, that's his graduation piece. And not only that, it was premiered in Berlin. Its international premiere was in the same year, 1926, and it had its American premiere in 1927. So here he is, this precocious, brilliant musical genius. He writes a symphony. I mean, you know, we were talking about Brahms yesterday. Brahms took years before he dared embark on his symphony because of the looming shadows of Beethoven. It's a huge thing. I mean, it's, in some ways, it's the sort of the Everest, isn't it, of composition. And here he is doing it flipping 19. And you think, what have I been doing with my life? Not writing symphonies. And the thing is, you look at his life and you just think, if only he'd not coincided almost perfectly with Uncle Joe. But he did, and this loomed large in his life because basically Stalin kept an eye on everything. There's a glorious scene in the Death of Stalin movie, Armando Iannucci's movie, which, if you haven't seen, it's darkly satirical, but it's brilliant, and it evokes things. It's set in the 50s rather than the 30s, but it's of a piece, and it opens with the famous apocryphal, but it is based on the kinds of things that did happen. Is it a Mozart concerto or Beethoven, I can't remember which, is being performed, and the bloke forgot to put the recording wax cylinder on, and so they have to get the whole orchestra and the audience and everybody back to re-record it so that Stalin can be sent his personal copy of the concert. And it's utterly absurd. But basically that epitomizes the situation. The whole sort of apparatus of the state revolves around this madman who himself is a genius in the Kremlin. There was nothing to be done about it. He was in power, and nobody could conceive of a world without him in power. It's very interesting. After Stalin died, Khrushchev, against the odds, really, in some ways, became the leader, and he started doing a speaking tour around the USSR, speaking to the individual Soviets. Soviet is just a word that means a committee, basically. So each of the states belonging to the Union had its own Soviet, a Supreme Soviet. And Khrushchev started doing a tour of all the Soviets around, and the famous story, it was got reported in the West as the so-called secret speech, where for the first time he denounced Stalin publicly, and this began the thaw, and Stalinism was supposedly ended for good, and there were some reforms. They kept it communist, of course, and Khrushchev was a communist, he believed in it, but a lot of the brutality and certainly the suppression of the arts was pulled back. But there's a story of one person shouting out to Khrushchev saying, why didn't you say anything in front of one of these Soviets? And Khrushchev, quick as a flash, shouted back, who is that? Silence. Now you know why no one said anything. It was life and death, even for composers. So I'm going to start with some music. People are intimidated by, a 20th century Soviet composer. You think, well, this is going to be really heavy and difficult and stuff. And there is some difficult stuff. As there is even for sort of popular composers like John Williams. I don't know whether you've listened to some of his concertos. They're not as accessible as Star Wars or The Empire Strikes Back or whatever. And some of his jazz, he started out as a jazz pianist. Some of his jazz, if you've seen the film Catch Me If You Can, I think his score for Catch Me If You Can, takes him back to his jazz roots. It is ingenious, that score, and it's fascinating. It's complex. So composers have, there's a whole range of things, but sometimes they can produce stuff that actually is very accessible. And Shostakovich could do anything. He really could do, he could write jazz, he could do popular stuff. He won a bet doing an arrangement of the song Tea for Two, and it became part of what was called his jazz suites. And he did it in less than an hour. He arranged the whole thing for orchestra with harmonic variations and stuff, and wrote the whole thing out literally in under 60 minutes to win a bet. But anyway, so here he's basically paying for his lot, and he's writing a piece called The Festive Overture, and he wrote it in 1947, and it's about 6 minutes. It's a lot of fun. I absolutely love it. Here we go. Thank you. What do you think is going on with that? What are your impressions of it? What's the mood? What's the experience of...
The ending is remarkably similar to the ending of the 1812.
Okay, so we're in the same world, the same part of the world as well, but there's a lot going on there. Yep. So he's learned his lessons from the masters, but he's also doing some interesting things of his own. What's the sort of mood or the emotional journey of it?
It's celebratory.
Yeah.
It's victorious.
Yep.
It's concluded.
I mean, it gets your heartbeat faster a little bit, doesn't it? And other impressions of it?
It's like a big military Christmas ball.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just at the sort of like the second phase of it, it was like there was an escape. It was like there was a mischievousness going on. It was like he'd come away from this big, grand, kind of traditional. I don't know. That was the way it came to be, that he was just being a bit naughty and sort of hiding and seeking and sticking his tongue out. But
well, whether or not he's doing that, there's certainly a sort of fun and sort of joie de vivre. There's, you know, I want a part of this. This is great. These guys look as though they're having a great time. I want to be part of that. Is at least what's going on, and maybe there's a bit of Yabu as well. I said it was commissioned and composed in 1947. Why might that be significant?
Celebrating the Russian victory in the Second World War.
Okay, so it's 2 years after the end of the war, and Russia was one of the victors. Anything else? Significant anniversary.
Okay, so is it 17 that's the revolution?
So that's right. So it's the 30th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. So it was commissioned for that. It's a festive overture, and it's a sort of a rallying point, isn't it? You listen to it. If you didn't know it was the Russian Revolution, you might think there's something great is going on, and it's this thing, gathering the crowds in the markets and say, come, we're going to have a party. It adds a slight sort of chill to know that the party is all about the revolution, knowing what we know. But he's basically being a very good Soviet composer. It's a glorious piece in its own right. And this is the thing. There were plenty of jobbing composers in the Soviet Union who did what they were told, but they didn't produce glory at the same time. Because very often, propaganda makes bad art. It takes a very special kind of artist to make something even that is propagandistic. And one of the key things to understand is that basically they were required to do things that were kosher, that there was a ministry of culture that was subdivided into all kinds of different divisions, and they would be led by sort of commissars who set the rules, often very arbitrary, for what painters could do, what composers, poets, novelists, you name it. And basically, they had to do what they were told. There was this thing of socialist realism, which basically was this idea that the art had to echo the victory of the revolution. So you were allowed to do the dark stuff because, of course, under the Tsars, if you were a serf, life was miserable, and the revolution was necessary because of how awful life was. And the reality is, for the vast majority of people living in the Russian Empire, life was truly terrible. And we mustn't forget that actually for a huge proportion of what became the USSR, life really was much better after the revolution. It really was. They actually lived in accommodation provided by the state. When, if you've lived in a hovel that you made of sticks in the middle of the tundra or whatever, and suddenly you get an apartment with running water and even heating, it's the difference between night and day. So for a lot of people, particularly in those sort of optimistic first 15, 20 years, there was a sense in which, yeah, things really are getting better. And there were plenty of people from the West who would travel to the Soviet Union and say they would marvel at this and report back and say, this is making people's lives much, much better. It was working to some extent. We forget that. So there was plenty to celebrate. But as the revolution wore on, obviously there was still a lot of darkness, but you couldn't portray that because the revolution had to be seen to be making things constantly better. It's one of the reasons that there were all kinds of communist jokes. So if I can get this, I'll probably spoil it and give you the punchline in the wrong place. But a great one is, what's the difference between a capitalist fairy tale and a communist fairy tale? In the communist, oh gosh, here we go. I should have written this down. In a capitalist fairy tale, once upon a time, there's a paradise in the past. In a communist fairy tale, there's a paradise in the future. No, I've completely ruined it, and I'll have to look it up and I'll tell you properly later. I should have kept to my notes and not tried to be funny. But basically, in your art, you have to constantly show this progression. So you can start dark, but you've got to end in victory. And that piece, it is victorious, and it's great. I love it. I really love it. And I can listen to that and feel a bit more of a bounce in my step. It does the job, and I'm not glorifying the revolution, believe it or not. And there are various other strictures. I mean, these are a couple of there's a mosaic and a painting. Workers, glorifying the workers, and they're the ones who make the state possible, and all this sort of stuff. So you've got to glorify the party, so the party always knows what it's doing and we can trust the party to do stuff. So don't denigrate the party. You've got to reject Western influence. That's very interesting. You see that again and again because Western influence is by definition, I had the word and it's just gone. It's corrupt and it's bourgeois and it's very sort of subversive and unhelpful. It's interesting, just for the few years during the Second World War, that was sort of suppressed a little bit because, of course, suddenly the UK and US were allies. And so there was a bit more interaction, but then basically come 46, 47, it was over again because the Cold War was starting. So they're the enemy again. And then here's one of the things, you've got to stay accessible to the people. So you're creating art for the people. And this is one of the places where composers would get into trouble. If they were writing stuff that your peasant or your factory worker couldn't get, then it was ruled inadmissible. So this is one of the ways, and it was pretty arbitrary as to what criteria were used to judge that, but ideologically it was a very powerful tool, and it was one of the things that would actually get composers. So when Shostakovich writes his opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, that is the opera that gets him into big trouble. There's the review, muddle instead of music. One of the accusations was that basically this was inaccessible. It was about peasants, sort of working people, but it's, how can the ordinary sort of man and woman in the street understand that? They can't understand it. You've failed. You've not served the revolution of the people. And that was possibly going to mean execution. So the stakes are as high as they get, which, still, I mean, there's all kinds of sort of issues in Western culture and British culture and, sort of culture wars and stuff. But still, for the time being at least, it's not a capital problem. You're not likely to lose your life. There might be the odd outrage or whatever, but it's not a system. In the Soviet Union under Stalin, it really was a system. So, he who pays the piper calls the tune. It's always been like that. Mozart, Beethoven was one of the very, very first who did not have a piper payer. Yep.
Mark, you may be going on to this, but I'm I'm just thinking, contrasting that to Cocky, was it Symphony last night? That, you know, you kind of used the word like Disney. It sounded playful and fun and happy and jolly, but it was a bit hollow. To my ear, that sounded joyful, celebratory, playful, but genuine. Got the sense that Shostakovich was writing, you know, happiness onto the page to be delivered. What was there a sense, because there's maybe not too many years separating those two compositions. Do you think with Shostakovich, was he genuinely buying into the Soviet ideal to sort of manifest that, or was he able to write, shall we say, falsely? Was he able to, you know, because he's been paid, he's paid paper plays tunes, etc. But, you know, can you produce that kind of piece when you're not being sincere and honest?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I don't think we can ever really know what he thought, but actually, isn't one of the gifts of a great artist in any art form is that they can wear someone else's shoes and articulate their experience? Shakespeare would be a supreme example. You can't read, you know, Hamlet's part or Claudius's part or Gertrude's part and say, this is what Shakespeare thinks. What is astonishing is the richness and depth of each character, the main characters, that warrants deep searching. And, you know, those who are playing Shakespeare, they will spend a long time trying to figure out, you know, the sort of nooks and crannies of the emotional journey behind the part. And it's not reading stuff into it. It's there. You're trying to sort of bring out what is there. And what is astonishing is that suddenly here you have this playwright sitting at his desk, imagining what it's like to be, say, a queen whose husband has died, and then you're marrying the brother-in-law and have a son who's losing the plot. And suddenly he's thinking about what that's like. Has he experienced that? No. So what I think is different is that whatever the reasons, and he's writing to order, whether or not he believes in the revolution is probably immaterial, but he knows joy. He knows exuberance. He knows what it's like to have a party and to get people around. And one of the things we do know about Shakespeare is that, about Shostakovich, is that he loved football. He was an obsessive, and I've got, basically, you'll hardly ever see a photograph of Shostakovich smiling, except there are some photos of him at a football match and he's grinning from ear to ear. And he's there on the terraces chanting and everything. He was encyclopedic about his favourite team and stuff. He was obsessed. So he knows that experience. So I would say maybe he's articulating that. So isn't that what an artist does? They don't necessarily have to, you don't have to live every experience that you describe or paint or write about, but you have to inhabit it somehow. And that's an act of the imagination, which incidentally is why I think every pastor needs to read fiction. It's an absolute necessity. I would say it as strongly as that. It's a necessity because it forces you to live in somebody else's shoes just for a short time. And if you're not doing that, you'll be failing a significant proportion of your congregation. Now, I'm slightly exaggerating, but not a lot. And that's what is so remarkable about the real greats in whatever art form, is that they can inhabit so many different lives and contexts. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons I love U2, actually. A lot of U2 songs, Bono particularly, is very good at inhabiting different characters. You know, I count on one album, there are about 6 or 7 different characters, one of which is a traffic cop in Paris, another one is a paedophile priest at breakfast with his victim. Can you imagine writing a song about that? And another one is a jilted lover. Well, that's classic. Another one is, you know, might be a terrorist or somebody who was wounded in one of the bombs in Dublin done by the loyalists or whatever. Astonishing. But that's what great art does. You are forced to inhabit the world from somebody else's shoes. Does that
works? Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
It says something about the human spirit, that even in a context where the whole system is revolving around one man's ego, and there's so much suppression, that people still feel that. So there's something subversive about music, in the sense that it's expressing part of human nature.
Okay, hold that thought. That's really significant. I want to come back at precisely that. So when we get to it, if necessary, repeat that thought, because that's really interesting. Here's something that there's some controversy about his sort of biographies. So there was one biography supposedly written by a friend in dictation from him, and it's thought probably that quite a lot of that was basically faked. It's a book called Testimony by a guy called Volkov. There's some good stuff in it, but it's hard to know exactly how much actually did that come from Shostakovich. His children rejected that book, and there are various others who've actually written about him. One of the best places to get a sense of him is a book of letters to one of his closest friends, who was a playwright called Isaac Glickman. And so you get their correspondence. That's really interesting. And in one of the letters, he says this: I don't think that either so he's talking about, it's a slightly obscure thing, but he's talking about the role of the composer in this sort of kind of society, and how you're doing what you have to do, but keeping your integrity somehow. He says, I don't think that either self-deprecation or self-aggrandizement is among the denying qualities of the artist. In other words, there will be some who self-deprecate, there'll be others who are full of themselves and make themselves, publicized and so on. Beethoven could have been forgiven if his symphonies had gone to his head, because basically they were incredible. So it's justified. He was a genius. So if that gives him a big head, well, of course it does, because that's amazing. But he could not be forgiven for writing a piece that was amoral, servile, and the work of a flunky. So he is trying to be authentic and genuine in what he writes. And I think that reflects the same thing that we saw with Prokofiev last night. He knew that ending of the seventh, the official ending, that was not him. It was box ticking. I think that Festive Overture is genuinely him. It's I don't know, it feels, and it's a subjective, and maybe I'm wrong, but it feels authentic, because it sort of feels sort of warm-blooded, if I can put it like that.
It's a lie.
Yeah. It feels sincerely meant, with all its exuberance, for whatever reason. Now, the interesting thing is, it was not performed until 1954. Now, why is 1954 significant? Stalin dies in 1953. It was written for the revolution's anniversary, but actually it took on a meaning that it never was intended to have, but in its exuberance, it kind of became a rallying point for people's relief and joy that Stalin was dead. And it became incredibly popular. All under the guise of celebrating the revolution. Isn't that brilliant? Now, Shostakovich isn't thinking, I can't wait till Stalin dies and people can listen to this. But you can totally see why it takes on those connotations. But life was incredibly hard. There's an extraordinary line. Shostakovich said this: almost none of my friends avoided torture. Can you imagine? And it's likely that Shostakovich only avoided it because he was so good and so visible. And Stalin played with him like a cat does with a mouse. He would ring him up in the middle of the night and just F up his mind, play games with him on the phone. He was like that. He loved it. He was a total sociopath. You mentioned pain. So I think this is one of the interesting things. He was native of Leningrad, but spent a lot of his time in Moscow. But Leningrad was his home, St. Petersburg, Petrograd. and he loved his city and was very proud of it. And probably the piece that brought him to global attention, I mean, he was well known outside the Soviet Union, but the piece that really made him internationally a star was the Leningrad Symphony, written in 1942-43. And the reason that is so significant is because basically the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and they got right down as far as Ukraine was pretty much entirely annexed. We'll think about that tonight. But they were right up as far as, so Lenin on this map, Leningrad is here, so they haven't quite got there yet, but they will. And Moscow is over here. This is the last big holdout, but it's entirely besieged. And so basically from the Black Sea to the Baltic, the Nazis are in control. And Leningrad is holding out just, and basically it's got water on two sides. And it was absolutely brutal. And supplies, after a while, it was completely cut off here over land. So supplies were only able to get into the city in winter when this lake froze over and it could come over the ice. But in summer, it's kind of the opposite of what you would expect. In summer, people were starving. There was no food getting in at all. And there was the prestige of the fact that it was named after Lenin, but also the fact that it was the second city of the Union, and all kinds of things. So it was a real trophy if the Germans won that. And the siege of Leningrad is one of it coupled with the siege of Stalingrad down over here, was two of the most appalling atrocities in human history. And it's unimaginable. And the border, if you like, the front line, get this, was 2,500 miles long. All right? So that is the distance from London to Timbuktu in Mali, or from New York to Mexico City. That is the front line. And basically, the Soviet Union is desperately trying to hold on and protect 2,500 miles of border. It's just inconceivable. And so, you know, if Leningrad falls, that is going to be really, really massive. And, you know, it would mean probably that Moscow was coming next. And in fact, Stalin evacuated the government to Kubyshev, I can't remember how you pronounce it, but it's now the city of Samara in Eurasia. Basically evacuated the government to there because Moscow was under threat. All right, so that gives a sense of what's going on. And during this war, the siege of Leningrad killed more civilians than the bombings of Hamburg, Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki combined. Just one city. The US Military Academy evaluated that Russian casualties during the siege were bigger than the combined American and British casualties during the entire war. One city. And in the midst of this, Shostakovich writes a symphony. And the authorities smuggled him out, actually, as he was working on this, and he was taken to Kubyshev so that he could write it, because they could see the propaganda value of this. And he writes a symphony about being besieged, okay? And he was the city's most famous citizen, and you know, the propaganda value of that was immense, you know, just for rallying people. But in the West, it became a rallying point as well. And yet after it, he said this about the symphony. He said, "I feel eternal pain for those who were killed by Hitler, but I feel no less pain for those killed on Stalin's orders. I suffer for everyone who was tortured, shot, who starved to death." And partly I think that is because he knew at any point it could have been him. and it was probably fluke, perhaps. There were one or two massive close shaves in his life. There was a KGB guy who took an interest in him, and he'd had several meetings with him, and then the guy says, come back on Monday. Over the weekend, Shostakovich expected that this would be it because of the way the conversations would go, and it just so happened this guy was executed on the Sunday. So he turns up, he's not wanted, nobody knows. He gets away with it. I mean, you know, close shaves like that, you can't believe it. What he's doing here is he's expressing some of the public pain of this experience in the siege. So let me play you. Oh yeah, because of it, he got onto the cover of Time magazine, and he did some service as a night watchman and fireman. So there's a picture of him with his fireman's helmet, so that's good propaganda value. There he is. And this is just a little excerpt. And this photograph is from the premiere in Leningrad during the siege, August 1942. I'll say a bit more about it in a second. But this theme, very familiar, maybe it's been used by lots of things. It begins slowly, softly in the distance, and it gets louder and louder and louder. Thoughts?
Feel the stranglehold
Mm.
and the approaching with the different crescendos,
Mm-hmm.
the flute and then the piccolo on top, and then it transitions to the second and third and whatever.
I mean, if you imagine these vast panzer tank divisions, you can feel the rumbling in the earth before you see anything. Thousands of these tanks heading for you. And then basically there were trenches all the way around. Now what they did during the siege is that they rigged up speakers all along the front line and played the concert live to the Germans. And it's recorded. It had the intended effect. They were utterly sort of shaken. They're doing this now? But there are extraordinary stories. There's a wonderful book. Where have I put that on here? I know that's, oh well, it doesn't matter. A wonderful little book by Stephen Johnson, who's a Radio 3, he's a musicologist, he presents things on Radio 3 sometimes. He's written an incredibly moving little book called How Shostakovich Changed My Mind. And basically it's about Stephen's mental health, and he had various psychotic phases. And he talks about his mother who was very bad. And he's a musicologist. He's written and performed and described all kinds of music and lots of favorite composers, but there was something about Shostakovich that would always get under his radar and really help him in his darkness. And he was trying to, what is it about this guy? And so he investigates, and sometimes you can get it on BBC Sounds. It's from a while back, but the book came out of a one-off documentary he did for Radio 3, where I think it must have been about 10 years ago. There were about 3 or 4 musicians left alive who had performed in that original performance. And the stories of what it was like are legendary. He spends a lot of time with this guy called Viktor Kozlov, who was a clarinetist. It was like the second tier orchestra. The best musicians had actually all been shipped out of the city long before. So it's like the B team, because they're the ones who are left in the city. And the Red Army had to go around, with the guns. Anybody who could play any instrument, they were sort of rallied around and sent to the concert hall for rehearsals. Now, things were so bad, people were so hungry that rehearsals could only last a maximum of 15 minutes at a time because the wind players and the brass players didn't have enough puff. They were just exhausted and starving. It's the B team. The conductor, Eliasberg, was quite a brute. He was a very hard taskmaster, but even he recognized he couldn't push people more. And Kozlov has said some amazing things. This is Stephen Johnson describing meeting him, and they're sitting in the guy's apartment, sort of chair to chair. Kozlov is leaning forward now, almost touching me, his eyes moist but radiant. He said there was a lot of applause. People were standing. One woman even gave the conductor flowers. Imagine, there was nothing in the city, and yet this one woman found flowers somewhere. It was wonderful. Then Johnson makes this fascinating comment. He said, there followed something crucial. This was not escapism, false hope, or desperate wish fulfillment. Quite the opposite, in fact. Kozlov again. The music touched people because it reflected the siege. This was wartime, and everybody felt that they shared and understood this music. People were thrilled and astounded that such music was played even during the siege. Johnson goes on, in the Leningrad Symphony, Shostakovich held up a mirror to horror and reflected that horror back to those whom it had all but destroyed, and in response they roared their approval, their delight, their gratitude to the composer for giving form to their feelings. He then, later on in the book, he has a conversation with Roger Scruton, recently died philosopher, who wrote a lot about music. And, excuse me, Scruton says something fascinating in it, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said basically with many, many composers who articulate their life experience brilliantly, They do so as I had this. I went through that. And we listen to it and maybe we share in their experience. And that gift of that music is a gift. It's a generous gift. He said, but there was something about Shostakovich where he never said I, he always said we. And I totally get that and have felt that. I'm going to play one last thing. And he's even saying we in his private pain. And I'm going to close with this. Chamber music is probably the most niche area of classical music for people to get. The sort of the bare bones, the core of chamber music will be the string quartet. So a couple of violins, viola and a cello, and with the odd variation on that. And you know, it goes back to Haydn particularly and others before that in the classical and Baroque. And it's music at its most pared down and pure and abstract. And it took me years to get into chamber music. I didn't really understand. I remember being taken to concerts at Wigmore Hall in London, which is very near where we used to live when I worked at All Souls. And Radio 3 Radio 3 is going completely down the tubes as far as I can tell. But they still do Monday lunchtime concert from Wigmore Hall every week. And it's one of the most beautiful chamber music concert halls in the world, and people from all over the world want to play there because it's perfect. And you know, it has a small stage. You can probably get a maximum, I don't know, 10 musicians on the stage, maybe a few more, I don't know. But basically it's perfectly sort of built and shaped for chamber music. You can hear everything. But it's difficult. You think, I just don't get this. But Shostakovich wrote a lot of chamber music. And of course, one of the great things about chamber music is that it's if you're a reasonably good musician, you can play it at home with friends. My wife is a violinist, her sister is a cellist, my mother-in-law is a trained concert accompanist. She was at the Royal Academy of Music. So music was very important to the family. And basically, for years and years, whenever they sort of came back for the holidays, they would play stuff. It was enviable. And so I do accept that chamber music is difficult to get into because it's most kind of refined and abstract. But I want to play you a little bit as I finish that I think is extraordinary. And it's his 8th quartet. The circumstances of its writing are very, very important. In one letter he wrote to Glickman in 1961, so it's almost a decade after Stalin is gone. And he writes this: I jump out of my skin every time I see a policeman. Weirdly, I can relate to that because a couple of things that happened to me in Uganda, I was arrested falsely twice. And for years, coming back to London in 2005, I would have sometimes panic attacks just hearing a police siren. We lived in W1. You hear a lot of police sirens. But he was a determined musician. He was going to do it. He said in one letter to another friend, he said, if they cut off my hands, I will compose music anyway, holding the pen in my teeth. There was a guy in the Communist Party who was determined to get Shostakovich. He resisted joining the party for years. Well, it's now 1960, and he'd been elected the first secretary of the Union of Russian Federation Composers. So it was a sort of political appointment and stuff. And so the pressure on him now to join the party was immense. And there was this guy called Pospelov, who was obviously a bastard, basically, and had a beeline for Shostakovich. It was going to be his life's work to get him in the party. And so he would call him into his office again, and again. And he would come up with excuses every time. You know, he would say, oh, well, I never really succeeded in grasping Marxism. And he had the fact that he failed the first paper as an excuse. He said, oh, no, but there's always time to learn. Then he would plead religious views, which they both knew was not true, and so on and so forth. But eventually, he just couldn't do it anymore. And he wrote to Glickman, he said, later I had another meeting with Pospelov when he renewed his efforts and once again backed me into a corner. I lost my nerve and just gave in. And he became a party member and was elected to the Duma, the Russian parliament. And he never got over the shame of that. So to those who say he was a party stooge, you have this quartet. He was meant to write some scores for a film, a sort of propaganda film. And so he was down at one of these composer retreat places, and he was he just couldn't do it. He just couldn't write this film music. In the end, he started his eighth quartet, as we now know it, and he hardly ate and slept. It was just like driven to write this piece. And one of the things you need to know about it is a sort of his musical signature. Now that is Shostakovich in music. Now don't ask me to explain it, I don't understand, but in German notation, for some reason, an E flat is an S and a B natural is an H. Now Bach did this all the time because B-A-C-H is his name, and you find his signature in the scores all over the place. All over the place. And sometimes, even saying in the context of a moment in a piece of music, say in the Matthew Passion, he's saying, I'm here with this. This is what I believe. And so Shostakovich does exactly the same thing, because E flat is S and B natural is H. In Anglophone world, we don't do that. We're much more logical. But anyway, there we are. So that's his signature. Du, 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 du. If you know Benjamin Britten and some of his choral music, there's a piece called Rejoice in the Lamb. And remember, he's a very good friend of Shostakovich. Rejoice in the Lamb was written by Christopher Smart, who was in an 18th century mental asylum. He was very unusual and eccentric, and he thinks of all the things in his life that praise God, including his cat, Geoffrey. So Geoffrey spins round and round, and that's how he praises God. And then halfway through Rejoice in the Lamb, I remember singing this. I didn't know its significance at the time, but I was in choirs for years. There's a really emotional bit where the guard of this asylum beats me with his staff. That's what happens in the middle of it. And he says, no, but I'm going to still rejoice in the Lamb, in God. But the melody Britten uses for the Watchman is Shostakovich's signature. Because he says, for silly fellow. And basically, it is Shostakovich himself under communism, and it's the same effect. But anyway, that's a complete red herring. I'm going to play you the opening bars of the eighth quartet. I'll play this, then say something very briefly, and then we'll have lunch. writing to Glickman about the film score he was supposed to be doing. He said, "I still haven't managed to get anywhere. Instead, I wrote this ideologically flawed quartet, which is of no use to anybody. I started thinking that if someday I die, nobody's likely to write a work in memory of me, so I better write one myself. The title page should carry the dedication to the memory of the composer of the quartet." 2 years after its premiere in 1962, the Borodin Quartet, so these guys here, played the work to the composer at his Moscow apartment, hoping for some constructive criticism. Instead, Shostakovich buried his head in his hands and wept, at which the musicians decided that the best thing to do was to pack their instruments and creep away.
I've got to ask. I've got to ask. Is this an astonishing regret? Or is he hearing that music and is he realising he's absolutely captured what he wanted to?
He was as closest to suicide of his life at this time. In a way, this is a musical suicide note. And actually, I think you can hear, at later points in the quartet, you can hear the KGB banging on his door. So we're back to where we started, him waiting to be picked up.
Mark, there was a discussion earlier about kind of the institution and the individual, and it seems to me that there's something really powerful on that level here. On the side of the state, you've got an individual, Stalin, who is saying, you will feel this. Can use music, propaganda. It has to be accessible to the people, but what he really means is it has to have propaganda value. So one individual is the heart of the institution, and there's the abuse. The institution is his ego, large, and then you've got an artist who is expressing his own feeling, an individual. But now that is not, you will feel this, but you do feel this. And so everybody feels connected by that, because he's not forcing common ground, he's expressing something that everybody, that touches everybody. And again, for me, that's back to something about our humanity that God has created. That if you lose that, why are totalitarian governments so keen to suppress religion, to suppress art, to suppress music, or control those things? Is because in suppressing that or controlling that, they are suppressing and controlling humanity. It's an anti-humanist
Absolutely right.
understanding of people.
Absolutely right.
It's powerful.
Okay, I don't know whether I speak for others here as well. I could hardly bear to listen to that.
It's agony.
I wanted to run. The sense of that sorrow, if this is the expression of this man's heart, it's unbearable.
To my mind, this is kind of his Psalm 88.
Yeah.
So my book on depression takes its title from the last verse of the darkness seems your closest friend. He doesn't have an eternal hope. But I thank God for him. I really do. This is common grace at its most special, in a way. He shows me a lot more what it means to be a human being than many Christians do.
Let's pray.
Father, we have that melody ringing in our minds that expresses so much sorrow and lament and brokenness, and is a right ordered response to what is wrong in the world. It's a right response to things not being the way that they're supposed to be. And we collectively then come to you crying out, how long, O Lord, longing for your redemption, thanking you and trusting you in many cases despite our feelings and despite what we see around about us, trusting that you are the one who is good and can be trusted and who will put things right, and you are putting things right. Help us then to trust you, help us to know something of that, but help us, Lord, not to gloss over that pain and that sorrow of things not being as they're supposed to be. We pray that we might lament and sorrow together, but also look to you out of that sorrow. We thank you that in Jesus we are not those without hope. Father, I thank you for what Mark has brought to us, bearing something of his own soul this morning as well. Pray you'd protect and guard him. And for those of us here who are feeling this and perhaps relating so much of it to personal experience and circumstances, Lord, we pray that there would be comfort also, not least through the friendships and fellowship here. We thank you for the food we're about to enjoy, the conversations, the relationships through this day. We pray that you would be at the heart of them, that we might know something of the joy of the Creator and Redeemer, the joy of your salvation this day. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.